Gunfire shattered the stillness of the Texas brush country, echoing off live oaks and cedar brakes. Horses screamed as bullets snapped through branches, riders ducked low in their saddles, and dust rose in choking clouds. When the smoke lifted, another man lay face down on a rutted trail, blood sinking into the hard ground. By the 1870s, DeWitt County knew that sound too well. The Sutton-Taylor feud had turned familiar pastures and courthouse steps into places where men fell without warning and without trial. The roots of the fight ran through the war's end and the bitterness that followed. The Taylors were an established ranching clan centered around Creed Taylor, a former Texas Ranger whose name carried weight along the Guadalupe. Their loyalties were Confederate, and their reach stretched through kin and neighbors across DeWitt and Karnes counties. On the other side stood William E. Sutton, Bill to most, also a Confederate veteran, but aligned after the war with the Republican-backed Reconstruction government. In 1870, he wore the star as a deputy in the Texas State Police, the force created to impose order on a state still raw from defeat. To the Taylors and their allies, that badge looked like the hand of an occupying power. To Unionists and freedmen who needed someone to call, Sutton looked like the law finally arriving. At first, the conflict looked like a campaign against rustling. Sutton's men served warrants and hauled in suspects tied to stolen cattle. Several had Taylor blood or Taylor friends. Some prisoners never made it to a courtroom. Reports said they tried to run and were shot. Rivals said Sutton's deputies were using the law to settle scores. Jim Taylor, one of Creed's sons, answered with his own kind of enforcement. People who crossed the clan began turning up on the wrong end of a shotgun. What might have remained a tense disagreement over stock and authority hardened into a vendetta. The first clear markers of the war were bodies. In 1868 and again in 1870, Taylor cousins were gunned down in the brush, and their deaths were answered by ambushes on Sutton partisans. By 1872, a Sutton ally, Deputy Sheriff Charles Matthews, was shot and killed. The back roads of DeWitt County turned into sudden killing grounds. A rider crested a low rise and never reached the other side. A store door swung open, and a man walked into a hail of bullets. Families nailed planks across windows, stacked cordwood near gates to use as cover, and kept lanterns dark after dusk. In 1873, William Sutton was accused in the shooting of a Taylor relative. Accounts differed, as they often do when the witnesses are kin, but the effect was the same. The feud exploded. The courthouse at Clinton saw men arrive armed for proceedings. Saloons in Cuero heard more arguments end with gunfire than with apologies. Newspapers across Texas carried dispatches from the county, turning local pain into statewide spectacle. That same season, former state police captain Jack Helm, feared by rustlers and hated by many, was lured from a store and shot to death, a warning that no badge could guarantee safety. Sutton tried to work through the storm. Backed by a government many neighbors despised, he kept after men he believed were thieves and killers, and with each arrest, the target on his back grew. By early 1874, he was planning to leave. Fate did not give him the chance. On March 11, 1874, at Indianola on the Gulf, Sutton and his friend Gabriel Slaughter boarded a steamboat, hoping distance would break the chain. Gunmen were waiting. Shots cracked across the deck before the lines were cast off. Sutton collapsed and died in his wife's arms. Slaughter fell beside him. The killing told both factions the same thing. The feud would follow a man to the water's edge. The year that followed bled like an open wound. Barns went up in flames. Riders were cut from their saddles on the road between Cuero and Clinton. Court days drew extra patrols that could not stop murders on the square. Farmers carried rifles to the fields. Parents kept children inside after dusk. By the mid-decade, the tally of dead ran into the dozens. The Texas Rangers rode in, their patrols bringing brief stretches of quiet. But as soon as they turned away, the gunfire started again. Local sheriffs were outnumbered, outgunned, or tied by blood and politics to one side or the other. Trials stalled. Witnesses stayed home. The feud did not look like the showdowns in pulp stories. It was crouched figures behind fence rails at dawn, pistols shoved through a gap in a slat. It was a knock at midnight and a door splintering in. It was a wagon halted in a low spot and a man hit from behind a pile of cedar posts. Each death was not an ending but the beginning of the next. A grave on one ranch meant a rifle lifted on another. Ordinary people learned to treat a trip for water as a risk calculation and to ride with eyes fixed on every cut in the road. Names that loomed large in county talk burned out one by one. The men who drove the violence most relentlessly began to fall to it. In 1875, the most feared of the clan, Jim Taylor, was himself cut down in a saloon in Caldwell County. The man who had seemed to push the feud by sheer force of will died by the same rules he enforced. With Helm gone, Sutton murdered, and Jim Taylor killed, the gears of revenge started to grind without power. Some gunmen fled DeWitt County. Others landed in jail on charges that had nothing to do with the feud. A few simply aged out, choosing fences and calves over gun belts and midnight rides. By the late 1870s, the feud began to lose air. There was no treaty, no handshake on a courthouse porch. The smoke thinned because too many men were already in the ground. Estimates put the dead between 35 and 40, with dozens more wounded or driven into exile. Ranch houses went vacant. Herds were scattered. The county's name became a warning in distant towns, proof that law and politics can fail so completely that neighbors become enemies in their own streets. Life returned by degrees. DeWitt County kept ranching and planting. Courthouses heard more property disputes than murder charges. But the memory of those years did not leave. Older men kept rifles within reach long after the fighting ended. Mothers watched windows on windy nights. A generation grew up on stories about which road not to take and which porch to avoid. Later writers tried to frame the feud as folklore, but people who had lived it remembered it as a grind, long, senseless, and close enough to touch. What set the Sutton-Taylor feud apart was not a single spectacular battle or one famous gunman. It was duration. For close to a decade, a private war stretched from DeWitt into Karnes and Caldwell counties, killing steadily, resisting every attempt to smother it, and swallowing men on both sides until there was nothing left to feed it. When historians call it the longest feud in Texas history, they are pointing to a community that spent years learning how fragile order can be when vengeance takes its place. The lesson left behind is simple and hard. Reconstruction politics mattered. Badges, courts, and elections shaped who held power and who felt cornered. But once the cycle of retaliation began, reasons mattered less than names. A cousin killed in 1870 claimed a brother in 1872 and a father in 1874. By the time the last shot sounded, no victory was possible. Only survival counted. Today, the roads between Cuero, Clinton, and the old settler cemeteries look quiet under live oaks. Fences hold cattle. Church bells carry on still mornings, but the ground keeps its record. Somewhere under those trees lie unmarked graves of men whose families stopped asking why and started counting who. The longest feud in Texas did not end with a truce. It ended because a county ran out of sons to lose. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier